Hello guys, my name is Msawashan Baiwa. I'm a lecturer in the Management Accounting and Finance Department at Chartered Accountants Academy. And today, I'm going to be taking you through cost classification. So what are the specific learning objectives? So at the end of this lecture, you should be able to define and illustrate a cost. You should be able to explain and distinguish costs, and you should be able to describe and apply different methods of estimating costs, otherwise what is known to you as cost estimation. Now let's start. What is a cost? So a cost is a resource sacrificed or foregone to achieve a specific objective. In this case, which can be an organizational goal. An example, for a total cost for a product is material plus labor plus overheads. So, moving on, when we are discussing costs, we have what we call major assumptions when we are dealing with these costs. So we are going to be discussing the major assumptions as we are discussing these costs class by class. So as I move on to cost classification, I'm going to discuss the first classification for costs, which is classification by behavior. By classification by behavior, it means what? Costs are classified differently depending on the manager's needs or the specific purposes. So first of all, I can classify by behavior, meaning I can be able to determine how a cost behaves or responds to a certain variable. In line with this, I now have what I call a fixed cost, which means what? It is not affected by changes in in the level of activity. So a fixed cost does not change depending on the level of of activity. For example, if a classroom basically covers 50 students, if the maximum number of students that a classroom can have is 100 students, if rental for a room for which covers 100 students is 500, whether I have 1 student, I have 2, I have 10, I have 50, I still pay the same the same 500. Unlike a variable cost. Now, a variable cost, it changes in relation, or it changes in direct proportion to the level of activity. So if 1 cake requires 5 eggs, if I bake 2 cakes, I expect to use how many? 10 eggs. If I bake 50 cakes, I expect to use how many? 250 eggs. As an example. So as we go on to further classify costs, we have what we call semi-variable costs. So a semi-variable cost means it contains a certain element of of fixed cost, but the larger proportion is is a variable cost. An example of a semi-fixed cost can be your telephone bill. If you have a telephone bill, whether you use your phone or you don't use your phone, there is a certain fixed charge that you are supposed to pay. Maybe it's $10 that you pay for having that telephone line. From there onwards, any additional calls that you make are adding on top of the $10. So now that classifies an example of a semi-variable cost. So it maintains a certain element, which is the fixed element is constant whether I pay or whether I use my telephone or I don't use my telephone. And the variability comes now in relation to the minutes that I called and so on. In the same classification, we have what we call step fixed costs, otherwise referred to as semi-fixed costs. So step fixed cost or semi-fixed cost remain constant at a certain level until then they increase in a step-like fashion. Using the same example that I used for a fixed cost, the rental example. If I now want to accommodate 300 students, the room for 100 is likely not going to be functional. So I'm supposed to get an additional room, which comes at likely at a higher charge. So it was constant at the 500 till I got to student 101. It is now starting to increase up until a certain level. Then they continue in a step-like fashion. So these are the costs we discuss when we speak about classification by behavior. Moving on, we have classification by traceability, which means can I be able to trace it to a certain product. From there is where we emanate, where direct costs and indirect costs come from. In the same bracket, we have what we call manufacturing and non-manufacturing costs. So an example of a direct cost can be what? Can be the wages of material or the labor. But an indirect expense can be stationary. So in any business, it uses what? Stationary, but it's an indirect cost, which means it's not the first cost you think of. For example, when you hold this laptop, or when you are thinking about costs generally. But for a manufacturer, so that's the distinction between a direct and an indirect cost. Moving on to the manufacturing and non-manufacturing costs. The classification is relates to whether the cost is it used in the manufacturing process or in the non-manufacturing process. So a direct cost likely is a manufacturing cost. But an indirect cost can be an example of a non-manufacturing, like the stationery that I used. It's an indirect cost which is related to non-manufacturing. Moving on, the third class is classification by controllability, meaning what? Can I be able to control that cost, or can I not be able to control that cost? From there, I have what we call a committed cost and a discretionary cost. So if it is discretionary, it means if I have a cost, it is at my discretion. I'm the one who decides whether to have the cost or not have the cost. Unlike a committed cost, whether I want or I don't want, I'm supposed to have that cost. So if I control it, it's a discretionary cost. So if you are a manager, you can control your what? If you are a manager, try to think, if you are a manager, what can you control? You can control the direct labor that you use in your manufacturing process. How? You can determine the number of casual workers that you want to come in for work. You can say, this day is busy. I want probably one. And like in the what? This day is not busy. So maybe I need two. And like at month end where I require more casual workers. That is different when you are deciding and like when you are deciding the salary of that casual worker, that might be a committed cost because you cannot control that cost. You are told by the supervisor or by the MD that the cost for a casual worker is $50 per hour. So I hope you can be able to see the clear distinctions between controllability and non-controllability. So just to add on, the controllability aspect comes from which areas an employee can be able to control. That is an area where they are responsible for. So cost center managers are able to control costs. An investment center manager might not be able to control my costs. What costs? Just moving on, we have classification by relevance, meaning what? We have relevant and irrelevant costs. in this classification of relevant and irrelevant costs, now comes your sunk cost, your opportunity cost. So what is a sunk cost? A sunk cost is a cost that you incurred in the past, which is not going to affect your decision in taking another project or your decision in doing other activities. So it is a cost that is already acquired, where the total is not going to be affected is not going to affect the choice between various alternatives. As an example, if you as a student, when you were enrolling for your, say, your O-level or your A-level, if you buy a trunk, your trunk where you pack your books, is it going to affect the choice whether you go to Cal College or you go to say Heritage School? Likely the cost of the trunk is not going to affect your decision, but rather what's at Heritage and what's at Cal College. And in the same class, we have what we call opportunity costs. Opportunity costs measure the benefit that is lost or sacrificed when one course of action is taken. That requires an alternative course of action to be given up. So, an opportunity cost normally arises as a result of constraints. If you have the capacity, or if you had money to do both projects, normally an opportunity cost doesn't arise because you have nothing to sacrifice. You can afford to do both projects. But an opportunity cost now comes as a result that you cannot be able to do one project. So I'll take an example of, if you are in the business or if you are in the bread making industry, you might probably choose bread over cakes, given the demand for bread, maybe due to the flour constraints. Remember, the country is due to foreign currency shortages. The bread making industry is now facing flour constraints, wheat constraints, which translate to the flour that they use. Most of the wheat requires foreign currency. So to that extent, flour might be a constraint in the bread making business. So if you have 50 kg of flour and you have to choose between baking cakes or making bread, likely you are going to make bread. So by virtue of you choosing to make bread over making cakes, you are foregoing the revenue that you could have obtained by you baking both cakes and bread, which is the opportunity cost. So we covered opportunity cost. We also covered a sunk cost. Those are the major costs under classification by relevance. So a sunk cost is irrelevant for your decision making, but an opportunity cost is relevant for your decision making. Because by you choosing one alternative, you are foregoing the other, which means it's going to affect your decision. Now I move on to cost estimation. Why would you want to estimate costs? Can you think of some of the ideas why we would want to estimate costs? So maybe most of the times you want to estimate costs because you want to prepare budgets. So for us to be able to budget, we are likely going to estimate some of the costs. So some costs are easy to classify as fixed, as variable, as semi-fixed, or as variable. But for others, you first of all need to identify which class they are, because they contain an element of fixed and an element of variability. So now that's where cost estimation comes. Because if you are given an amount or a total cost, you are not sure which of that total cost, which one is the fixed element, which one is the variable element, which you are going to use for your for your budgets, which you are going to use for your for decision making. Remember, when we are making decisions, variable costs are the ones we use when we are for decision making, unlike fixed costs, which are likely going to remain constant over a certain range of output. So with that in mind, I need to first of all classify my variable costs, which I'm going to use for making decisions. So with that in mind, now let's discuss cost class estimation methods. The following approaches are used when you are estimating costs. We have, first of all, what we call engineering methods. As the name suggests, we are going through motion studies. After a certain range of, we are going through evaluations. Maybe you visit a factory, you observe, you make your evaluations. After that, you can be able to determine roughly how long it takes to produce something, which you can translate to a cost. In this case, an engineering approach requires close study of the product itself, the good that the manufacturer produces. All other expenses such as material, labor, and overheads play a very important role. So it is called an engineering method. Why? Because much of the data is based on not previous product sales, but on the evaluation, on the opinions of industrial engineers with experience in the business. This method is based on the use of engineering analysis of time and motion studies, like I explained earlier. So after observing, I can be able to convert the physical quantities from an activity into a cost. So this method, when is it most useful? It's most useful when we are estimating cost for a repetitive process. It's also important when the output and input relationship is clearly defined. I'll move on to the next one, which is the graphical or scatter graph method. As the name suggests, I use a graph to estimate my cost. By using I use the equation y is equals to a plus bx. So using the same equation, I present it on a graph, and then I can be able to estimate my costs. How can I be able to estimate my costs? We draw a regression line. After the line is drawn, it is then used to estimate the total fixed cost and the variable cost per unit. We move on to the high-low method, which we are going to discuss later, and the least squares method. So the least squares method is similar to the graphical or scatter graph method. The only difference is that with the least squares method, we are using statistics to come up with our estimated costs. We use the same equation, but we make use of statistics to come up with our fixed costs and our variable costs. Now let's move on to the high-low method. The high-low method consists of selecting periods of highest and lowest activity levels and comparing to changes in costs that result from the two levels. So let's have an example so that we can illustrate how a high-low method looks like. So when we are using high-low, I take my highest cost and I subtract from my lowest cost. So in this case, this is X, this is Y. So it's X minus y, which is the dollar sign, the amount, divided by the highest activity, which is 30,000, less my lowest what? Activity level. From there, I determine my variable cost per unit of how much? Of $8 per unit. From there, I can be able to now calculate my what? My fixed cost. So if I pick the 12,000 from a total cost of 276, if variable cost per unit is 8, 12 times 8, it gives me how much? Less the total fixed cost, I get a fixed cost of 180,000. So that is how I'm able to determine the variable overhead tariff using this equation, and the total fixed overhead cost by subtracting the variable cost from the total cost. So now let's summarize what we just learned. So for classification of costs, you can classify using various methods, but we discussed by behavior, by controllability, by function, or by the nature, where we discussed in behavior, fixed cost, variable cost, which can be semi-variable, and for decision making, that's where we cover relevant costs and irrelevant costs. For controllability, we said we have controllable and uncontrollable, where we said we have committed and discretionary costs. So should you feel you need more clarity, you can come through for consult for physical contacts, or you can make use of your WhatsApp consults. Otherwise, make sure you attempt all questions in your modules relating to cost classification. Thank you for going through this lecture. See you next time.